The balloon army that fooled Hitler. Topic: the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the U.S. Ghost Army, that used inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, and sound trucks. Viral hook. The German general surrendered to a balloon. Thumbnail idea: inflatable Sherman tank in B&W. Dawn seeped over northern France like a dying ember, weak and colorless, spreading across frozen fields still scarred by tank tracks and shell craters. The air tasted of cold iron, the metallic hint of war that clung to everything in 1944. A low mist rolled over the lonely crossroads near Chaumont, swallowing the landscape in a gray, shapeless haze. In that fog stood a single American private. No division behind him, no artillery, no tanks. Just one man gripping his M1 rifle so tightly the bones in his knuckles ached. His breath trembled in the morning air as he watched the silhouette approaching, slow, deliberate, unmistakably German. The boots struck the frozen ground with the authority of someone who had commanded armored battalions across half of Europe. A long coat rolled with each step. A peaked officer's cap emerged through the fog. Then a gloved hand raised. Surrender. The private swallowed. Hard. He had been briefed on dozens of things that could happen behind enemy lines. Ambushes, counterattacks, booby traps. But never this. Never this precise nightmare. A German general was surrendering to him. The lone soldier. The lookout. The distraction. A high-ranking officer. A veteran of the Eastern Front. A commander of panzers. Slowly approached with the poise of a man accepting defeat with bitter dignity. Amerikaner, he said quietly, his voice low and steady. Ich ergebe Michigan. I surrender. The private's pulse hammered in his ears. Because he knew the truth, the catastrophic, absurd, terrifying truth. He wasn't backed by an armored division. There was no armored division. The tanks the Germans believed were hidden in the fog behind him were nothing but rubber. Inflatable Shermans. Canvas half-tracks. Painted shadows of artillery guns. And the troops filling the roads and fields? A few hundred men. Artists, radio operators, sound engineers, not soldiers. Set designers who had built Broadway musicals. Painters who once did department store windows. Sound specialists who had spent their careers making Hollywood jungles roar with fake lions. They were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The Ghost Army. A unit so secret that even most American generals didn't know they existed. The German general stopped just a few feet away. He looked past the private into the fog, searching for the rumble of engines, the silhouettes of tanks, the unmistakable bulk of a U.S. armored force. But the fog revealed nothing, because there was nothing. Every tank he feared, every Sherman he believed was pointed at his retreating forces was an illusion. A brilliant, terrifying trick conjured from air, rubber, and the minds of men who had turned deception into a weapon of war. The private steadied his rifle, trying to hide the tremor in his arms. A general, a panzer commander, surrendering to a phantom army. The Ghost Army had done it again. Rewritten the rules of war with canvas, air compressors, and pure imagination. Somewhere in the fog, a balloon tank creaked as the morning cold tightened its rubber skin. The private prayed the general wouldn't hear it. Understand how a German general could surrender to a balloon. We must rewind the clock. To a year earlier, when the Allied High Command faced a problem so large, so impossible, that only illusion could solve it. By early 1944, Europe was a fortress. Hitler had turned the western coastline into the Atlantic Wall, 6,000 miles of concrete bunkers, artillery batteries, minefields, and machine gun nests designed to slaughter any invasion force long before it reached the beaches. Even with American industry roaring at full strength, even with British resolve hardened by years of bombing, a frontal assault on France seemed like suicide. Eisenhower knew it. Churchill knew it. Every Allied planner knew it. But Hitler believed something else, something that gave the Allies one tiny, fragile chance. He believed the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between England and France. Not Normandy. Not the beaches destined to be named Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Calais. If the Allies could keep him believing that, if they could force him to commit tanks, artillery, and elite divisions to defending a place the Allies never intended to attack, then the real invasion might stand a chance. The problem? Hitler's spies, his reconnaissance planes, his codebreakers, all of them were watching. Every field in southeast England was photographed, mapped, analyzed. Every convoy was counted. Every tank was spotted. So the Allies faced a question no army in history had ever asked. How do you build an entire army that does not exist? They needed a whole armored division, tanks, trucks, artillery, supply units, engineer battalions, without using a single real tank that was desperately needed for D-Day. They needed tens of thousands of fake soldiers, fake vehicles, fake radio traffic, fake factories, fake barracks, all convincing enough to fool the most paranoid intelligence service on Earth. It was madness. It was impossible. So the Allies turned to the only people capable of doing the impossible. Artists, men who could bend perception, men who understood shadow and silhouette, men who knew how to make something appear real from a distance, even if it wasn't real at all. Broadway set designers, Hollywood sound engineers, commercial illustrators, painters, architects, radio magicians. They were gathered, quietly, secretly, into a unit with a name that sounded more like a magician's guild than an army formation. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Barely 1,100 men. Yet their mission was to impersonate 30,000. To make the Germans hear tank brigades where there were none. To make aircraft photograph artillery batteries that didn't exist. To make entire divisions appear overnight and vanish the next day. They would use deception as a weapon more potent than any tank. And they would become the Ghost Army. A force the Germans would fear, even though it was made of rubber, canvas, plywood, and sound. What these men would build, what they would summon from thin air, would shape the fate of Europe. And for one German general, it would end in the most humiliating moment of the war, surrendering to a balloon. The first time Private Bill Anderson saw an inflatable Sherman tank, he laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was terrifying. The thing sat in a clearing like some grotesque shadow of a real machine. 11 meters long, 6 meters wide. The exact silhouette of a Sherman M4. Same turret shape, same gun, same angles, same stance. But it weighed less than a breakfast table. 2 men could lift it. 1 man could drag it. 4 men could make it appear out of nowhere. Even deflated, even folded, it carried the ghost of war within it. Anderson approached it with caution, like walking up to a sleeping animal. He touched the rubber hull. It was cold, smooth, slick with morning dew. And he realized something. This thing could win battles, without ever firing a single shell. The Ghost Army trained in absolute secrecy. They were told never to reveal their mission, not to their families, not even to other units. Their job was too strange, too unbelievable, too critical. Every day they drilled not just in military tactics but in theater. They learned how to build an army from nothing. Inflatable tanks that could be carried in duffel bags and inflated in 20 minutes with a gasoline-powered blower. Rubber jeeps that sagged slightly if you leaned on them, but looked perfect from 200 meters in the air. Canvas artillery batteries stretched over wooden frames painted in perfect camouflage. Fake radio networks operated by skilled signal teams who mimicked the chatter of entire divisions, from platoons to generals, faking everything from supply shortages to fictional tank breakdowns. Sonic deception units, massive speakers mounted on half-tracks, capable of blasting recordings of moving armor columns for miles. Dummy airfields, complete with fake runways, inflatable aircraft, and heat lamps to fool night reconnaissance. Everything the Ghost Army created had to be convincing to 3 audiences: German radio listeners, German aerial reconnaissance, German spies watching from occupied Europe. If they fooled even one, the deception might work. If they fooled all 3, Hitler would commit entire armies to chasing phantoms. The training grounds in England began to look like a surreal fever dream. A forest clearing filled with rubber tanks. A farm field sprouting wooden artillery like strange mechanical crops. Rows of dummy trucks parked on roads that led nowhere. Engineers testing tank engine recordings late into the night. Painters perfecting camouflage nets, adding fake shadows with charcoal. It looked absurd. It looked impossible. But every man there knew the stakes. A Ghost Army failure could doom the D-Day landings. A single mistake, an air pump left visible, a tank footprint too shallow, could expose the entire deception. And so they worked with the intensity of men building weapons that could not be allowed to fail. One afternoon, Captain Ralph Ingersoll, the journalist-turned-deception strategist, walked through the camp. He watched as 4 soldiers hoisted a deflated Sherman onto the grass. They fanned it out like a picnic blanket. A pump sputtered to life. The rubber shape began to rise, bulging, swelling, breathing. Slowly, a tank materialized. First the tracks, then the hull, then the turret lifting like the chest of a waking giant. Ingersoll smiled. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "this is how you move armies without moving armies." The Ghost Army had created something no one had ever seen before, a force built on air, shadows, and imagination. But the true test was yet to come, because within months these men would be deployed into real war zones. Places where German scouts watched every movement, places where failure meant death. Places where a rubber tank had to look real enough to trigger artillery strikes. And in one of those places, a German general would make the most humiliating decision of his life. He would surrender to an inflatable army. The Ghost Army's first true test came not in the chaos of Normandy, but in a quiet corner of France where the war seemed to pause, just long enough for deception to take root. It was late summer, 1944. The liberation of Paris had electrified the world, but the fighting had not stopped. The German army was retreating, but not broken. They withdrew in good order, digging into new defensive lines, waiting for the Allies to overextend. The front was fluid, confusing, dangerous, which meant it was the perfect environment for illusions. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, 1,100 artists, sound engineers, radio magicians, and camouflage specialists, received their orders: create an entire armored division overnight. One that does not exist. ***. They were assigned to impersonate the 6th Armored Division, which at that moment was fighting 60 miles away. Their fake presence was supposed to convince German intelligence that a massive Allied flanking maneuver was underway, threatening to punch straight through the German defensive line. If the ruse worked, the Germans would panic. They would divert troops. They would weaken their real defenses. They might even retreat. If it failed, the Germans would discover a camp full of rubber tanks and actors, and the Ghost Army would die before they could deflate a single balloon. The stage is set. The chosen site was a forest clearing near the town of Mary-sur-Seine. Scouts had already surveyed the area. The ground was firm enough for tanks, the roads wide enough for convoys, and the nearby rail lines perfect for supply drops. At dusk, the Ghost Army moved in. What happened next looked like an industrial miracle. Trucks rolled in carrying air pumps, canvas rolls, rubber hulls. In the fading light, teams worked with ruthless precision. Inflatable Shermans unfurled like sleeping beasts on the damp grass. Generators coughed awake. Floodlights blinked on. The hiss of compressors filled the air. Within minutes, tank silhouettes began rising from the soil dark, hulking shapes with wrong shadows and perfect outlines. From a distance, they were real. From the air, they were deadly. From the German perspective, they were an armored fist preparing to strike. Artillery that didn't exist. Nearby, other soldiers constructed a fake artillery park. Wooden howitzers painted in field gray. Canvas tubes stretched over frames. Dummy ammunition crates stacked high. Camouflage nets draped perfectly, complete with shadow detailing that fooled aerial photography. These weren't props. They were weapons aimed at the mind of the enemy. Every angle, every curve, every shadow was designed to survive the scrutiny of Luftwaffe reconnaissance. A symphony of lies. But the tanks and guns were only the beginning. The sonic deception unit, fitted with massive amplifiers, rolled its half-tracks into position on the treeline. The men queued up their recordings. Tank engines revving. Steel tracks grinding over gravel. Gearboxes shifting. Orders being shouted. Metal clanking. The roar of armored columns on the move. These weren't random noises. They were captured from real tank battalions by Hollywood sound technicians. At 3 a.m., the Ghost Army unleashed the soundscape. It echoed through the valley. Villagers miles away woke up believing thousands of tons of armor were moving under cover of darkness. German patrols reported the same. A massive armored force was assembling, preparing to strike, ready to carve a hole in the German line. A force that did not exist. The Germans respond. By morning, German reconnaissance planes circled the Ghost Army's position. Pilots peered through cameras, scanning the fields. They saw dozens of Sherman tanks, artillery in firing positions, supply trucks, fuel dumps, a division preparing for attack. Exactly what they expected to see. By noon, German officers were radioing headquarters. A large U.S. armored division has taken position near Mary-sur-Seine. In the German command bunkers, red pins shifted across maps. Panzer units were redirected. Infantry divisions repositioned. Defenses weakened in areas where the real U.S. forces would soon strike. The illusion had worked. The Germans were fighting shadows. And the end came quietly, not with tanks grinding through villages or artillery pounding defensive lines. Not with the roar of engines or the scream of shells, but with silence. Late in March 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine and the German defenses began to collapse like water-rotted wood, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops received one final assignment. Their job was simple: pretend to be everywhere. Pretend to be unstoppable. Pretend to be an army 10 times their size. The real U.S. divisions were stretched thin, exhausted from months of brutal winter fighting. If the Germans counterattacked at the wrong moment, the Allied advance could stall. So the Ghost Army stepped into the void one last time. They inflated hundreds of tanks. They strung miles of fake radio chatter. They blasted the night with the sound of armored columns that weren't there. They lit campfires, thousands of them, to convince German scouts that 20,000 men were on the move. In reality, fewer than 1,200 stood behind the illusion. Dawn. When the sun rose over the Rhine, a strange battlefield took shape. Fields shimmered with dew on rubber. Dummy tanks sat silently in the fog. Inflatable half-tracks leaned slightly in the wind. Wooden artillery pointed toward the east like props in a stage play. But from the German side, everything looked real. The silhouettes were right. The positions were correct. The scale was overwhelming. And most importantly, the Ghost Army held the high ground. To the German commander, it looked like an entire U.S. armored division had arrived during the night. He had no way of knowing the truth. A single bullet could have deflated the armor. A single shell could have sent wooden guns flying. A single patrol could have discovered the lie. But the Germans never got that close. They were tired, surrounded, outnumbered, or so they believed, and ready to believe anything that appeared larger than life. The alone general. Just before noon, a lone German Kübelwagen rolled slowly toward the American lines, a white flag tied awkwardly to its antenna. Inside sat a general, gray-haired, uniform immaculate, hands trembling slightly. He looked up at the hillside, at the rows of Shermans, silhouetted like metal giants against the sky. The general stepped out of the vehicle and approached the first American soldiers he saw, a group of tired, mud-caked Ghost Army engineers. He saluted with shaking hands and spoke in a strained voice. "I am prepared to surrender my division." The American lieutenant blinked. He had no idea what to say. Behind him, the inflatable Shermans swayed gently in the wind, their rubber skins creaking softly under the sun. The German general never noticed. He saw an armored juggernaut. He saw steel. He saw doom. And so, a man who believed he was surrendering to tanks, surrendered to balloons. The war ends. The secret lives on. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Ghost Army didn't march in victory parades. They didn't boast about their missions. They didn't tell their families what they'd done. Their existence was classified for more than 50 years. The world knew about the tanks that blasted through France, the infantry that liberated cities, the bombers that darkened the sky. But they didn't know about the illusionists, the men who fought a war with canvas and air, with paintbrushes and recording reels, with radios and imagination, The men who saved thousands of American lives by convincing the enemy to shoot at shadows. When historians finally learned the truth, they said something remarkable. The Ghost Army didn't just fool the Germans. They changed the outcome of the war. Because deception is a weapon. Illusion is a weapon. Belief is a weapon. And in that strange moment on the Rhine, when a German general surrendered to a rubber tank, the world witnessed the quiet, absolute power of a lie crafted with courage. A lone, inflatable Sherman tank sits on an empty field. Wind ripples its rubber hull. Sunlight hits it like a spotlight on an abandoned stage. A weapon of war that never fired a shot. But one battles all the same.